Picture this, late 1978, somewhere deep in the Tennessee mountains, a small block shop with a dirt floor and one single superflow dyno that's already seen more punishment than most men can handle in a lifetime. Sonny Leonard bolts down the very first true mountain motor, 815 cubic inches of hand-built American Fury, 5-inch bore spacing, billet steel crank, 7.75-inch titanium rods, symmetrical port heads the size of basketballs, and one giant 4-barrel Holley Dominator sitting on top like a crown. The operator cracks the throttle, the engine wakes with a roar that sounds like the devil himself clearing his throat, revs climb past 8,000, past 9,000, and then it happens. 1,831 horsepower slams the rollers so hard the dyno shaft snaps with a crack you can hear across 3 counties. The water brake explodes in a cloud of white steam. The concrete pedestal splits clean in half while grown men in National Hot Rod Association polo shirts dive for cover because the engine that just murdered a $250,000 dyno wasn't supercharged, wasn't on nitrous oxide, it was 100% naturally aspirated, breathing pure gasoline and rage. The second pull is worse. The whole building shakes, light bulbs pop, the neighbor's dog starts howling 2 miles away, and every official in the room realizes in that exact moment that this is no longer drag racing. This is an extinction event for every factory 358 and 500 cubic inch small block the National Hot Rod Association has spent a decade protecting. They called them mountain motors, they called them uncontrollable, they called them the end of pro stock as the world knew it. And within 24 months, the National Hot Rod Association rewrote the entire rulebook from cover to cover just to make sure you and I would never see one run under their lights ever again. This is the full, raw, old-school story of the engines that made Bill Jenkins' Vega look like a toy, that made Sox and Martin cry in their trailers, that made Detroit executives sweat through their suits, and that still, to this very day, make grown men weak in the knees when they hear one fire for the first time. If you ever stood in the grandstands with a ticket stub in one hand and a cold beer in the other while a hood scoop the size of a mailbox disappeared into a cloud of tire smoke, drop everything right now, turn this up until the neighbors complain, and let's go back to the greatest, wildest, most untamed era drag racing ever knew, because once you hear what these classic monsters really did, you'll never forgive the National Hot Rod Association for killing them. The birth of the mountain motor, late 1970s classic revolution. It all started the day the International Hot Rod Association looked the National Hot Rod Association square in the eye and said, "To hell with your factory 500 cubic inch limit, we're opening the doors wide open." 1978, the rulebook gets thrown in the trash, minimum weight stays 2,350 pounds but displacement is now unlimited, no ceiling, no mercy, just pure American greed for horsepower, and out of the backwoods shops of Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina crawled the maddest scientists drag racing had ever seen, men with grease under their fingernails and fire in their hearts, men like Sonny Leonard, John Caz, Billy Ivy, and a dozen others who took one look at the factory's small block blueprint and laughed until they cried. They grabbed 5-inch bore spacing Ford Cleveland blocks, they bored them until the cylinder walls were thinner than a beer can, they stuffed in billet steel cranks so long the counterweights almost touched. They hung 7.75-inch titanium connecting rods that cost more than most people's houses, they welded together symmetrical port cylinder heads the size of cinder blocks, they bolted on sheet metal intake manifolds taller than a 10-year-old kid, and on top they crowned the whole thing with a single Holley 4-barrel Dominator so big you could bathe a baby in it. The first time one of these creations fired on open headers the sound wasn't mechanical, it was biblical. Deep, guttural, earth-shaking roar that made dogs howl and women clutch their children. A sound that said, "Detroit, your time is over." The first time one hit the track at Rockingham or Bristol the grandstands went dead silent for half a second and then erupted like the end of the world. Because the 60-foot times were in the 1.20 range, the quarter-mile clocks were spinning into the low 6-second zone, and the speed guns at the top end were reading 220+ miles per hour on nothing but naturally aspirated gasoline, no power adders, no excuses, just raw, untamed cubic inches doing what cubic inches were born to do. The National Hot Rod Association officials stood on the other side of the fence with their clipboards and their factory contracts and watched their precious factory-backed 500 cubic inch small block cars get absolutely humiliated by independent hillbillies with welding torches and a dream, and you could see the panic in their eyes because the fans weren't just cheering, they were converting, they were crossing the line, they were buying International Hot Rod Association tickets instead, and the writing was on the wall in 10-foot-tall flaming letters. Mountain motors weren't just faster, they were the future. And unless the National Hot Rod Association did something drastic, the entire sport was about to leave them behind in a cloud of tire smoke and open-header thunder. NHRA watches in horror. The 1980s war begins. By the early 1980s, the war was no longer coming, it was here, and NHRA stood at the starting line with their jaws on the ground because across the fence the International Hot Rod Association had turned pro stock into pure mechanical pornography. 815, 820, 850 cubic inch mountain motors built by Sonny Leonard, John Cause, Billy Ivy, and a dozen other backwoods geniuses were absolutely annihilating everything in sight, running 6.30 to 6.40 quarter miles at 220 plus miles per hour on nothing but naturally aspirated gasoline, no superchargers, no nitrous oxide, just giant Holley Dominator 4-barrel carburetors sitting on top of sheet metal intake manifolds the size of coffee tables, symmetrical port cylinder heads flowing numbers that made factory engineers weep, and torque curves so fat you could drive a truck across them from idle to 9,000 revolutions per minute. The crowds at Bristol, Rockingham, and Darlington were no longer watching races, they were witnessing religious experiences, hood scoops disappearing into clouds of tire smoke 60-foot times in the 1.20 range, and when those mountain motor cars crossed the finish line the grandstands didn't just cheer, they roared like the end of the world had finally arrived and it sounded beautiful. Meanwhile, NHRA's factory-backed 500 cubic inch small block cars with their Chevrolet, Ford, and Dodge corporate paint jobs were getting absolutely embarrassed, losing by half a second and 20 miles per hour to independent racers running engines that cost more to build than most people's houses, and the fans knew it, the television cameras knew it, the sponsors knew it, and worst of all, the drivers knew it. Every weekend, NHRA officials watched their television ratings bleed while International Hot Rod Association events sold out months in advance, and you could see the panic rising in their eyes because the fans weren't just crossing over, they were converting by the thousands, trading their NHRA membership cards for International Hot Rod Association tickets and screaming for more cubic inches, more torque, more noise, more chaos. The factory teams started whispering in the NHRA boardroom, "If we don't do something soon, pro stock is going to die under our own banner." And the officials knew they had two choices: open the doors and let the mountain motors in, or slam them shut forever and pray the fans never noticed they just killed the greatest era drag racing ever saw. They chose the second option. They drew a line in the sand at exactly 500 cubic inches, they slapped on weight brakes, minimum weights, setback limits, and every other trick they could think of to keep the independents down and the factory contracts safe, and in one single rule change they declared war on the very thing that was saving the sport, because deep down they weren't afraid of the engines breaking dynos, they were afraid of the engines breaking their control, and the 1980s had only just begun. The dyno that changed everything. Sonny Leonard's monster. 1982, a dusty shop outside Lynchburg, Tennessee, one single superflow water brake dyno that has already seen more punishment than any machine deserves, and Sonny Leonard, the quiet mountain wizard with hands the size of dinner plates, bolts down the engine that will go down in legend as the one that made grown men cry and officials reach for the rulebook like it was a loaded gun. 823 cubic inches of pure evil, 5.0 bore spacing, billet steel. Crankshaft so long the counterweights almost kiss, 7.75-inch titanium connecting rods, symmetrical port cylinder heads flowing numbers that would make a top fuel engine blush, a sheet metal intake manifold taller than a 10-year-old child, and one giant Holley 4-barrel Dominator sitting on top like the crown of creation. The room is packed. A dozen International Hot Rod Association officials, a couple of nervous NHRA spies pretending to be spectators, and every independent engine builder within 500 miles who heard the rumors and had to see it with their own eyes. Sonny nods once, the operator cracks the throttle, and the world changes forever. The engine fires with a roar that rattles windows 3 blocks away, revs climb past 7,000, past 8,000, past 9,000, and then it hits. 1,831 horsepower slams the rollers so hard the entire dyno jumps 6 inches off the concrete mounts. The water brake explodes in a white cloud of superheated steam, the drive shaft shears with a sound like a 12-gauge shotgun inside a phone booth, the torque arm rips clean out of the floor, and the concrete pedestal splits down the middle with a crack you can hear over the open headers. The room goes dead silent for half a second, then every man in there starts shouting at once, half of them laughing like madmen, half of them looking like they just watched the devil himself climb out of that engine, and the NHRA spies don't say a word, they just turn white, pull out their notepads, and start writing the very first lines of what will become the 500 cubic inch limit that still chains pro stock to this day. Sonny just stands there in his flannel shirt, arms crossed, watching the smoke clear, and when someone asks him what he thinks he shrugs and says in that slow Tennessee drawl, "Reckon we need a stronger dyno." And in that exact moment, every official in the room realizes the game is over, because if one independent builder in a dirt floor shop can make 1800 horsepower naturally aspirated on pump gasoline, then every factory contract, every corporate sponsorship, every carefully balanced weight break NHRA spent a decade perfecting is now officially toilet paper. The dyno is dead, the concrete is cracked, the rulebook is bleeding, and the mountain motor revolution has just fired its first shot across NHRA's bow, loud enough to be heard from Bristol to Pomona and back again. NHRA's emergency counterattack, the 500 cubic inch wall. Monday morning after Sonny Leonard's dyno massacre, the phones at NHRA headquarters in Glendora, California, are melting. Factory executives from Chevrolet, Ford, and Chrysler are screaming down the line like their children just got kidnapped. Do something or we pull every dollar. And the officials know they are one bad weekend away from losing the entire sport. They lock the doors, pull the blinds, and in a smoke-filled room that smells like fear and burnt coffee they write the single most famous rule in pro stock history. Effective immediately, maximum displacement in NHRA pro stock is 500 cubic inches, no exceptions, no appeals, no mercy, and to make damn sure nobody sneaks around it they add a 2,350-pound minimum weight for anything bigger, a weight break so brutal it turns 850 cubic inch monsters into anchors. They call it returning to the factory hot rod spirit, they call it cost control, they call it safety. But every racer from Pomona to Indianapolis knows the truth. It is a death sentence for the mountain motor revolution, a panic move to protect corporate contracts and keep independent mountain geniuses from humiliating Detroit on national television every single Sunday. The rule hits the fax machines like a bomb. International Hot Rod Association laughs and keeps the doors wide open. But NHRA drivers and fans are stunned into silence because overnight the fastest, loudest, most soul-shaking engines in the world have just been outlawed under NHRA banners forever. The factory teams breathe a sigh of relief, the independents curse loud enough to peel paint, and somewhere in Tennessee Sonny Leonard reads the new rule, crumples the paper, tosses it in the trash, and quietly starts planning the next engine that will make 500 cubic inches look like a joke. The war is no longer about who is fastest, it is now about who gets to decide what fast even means, and NHRA just drew a line in the sand with a 500 cubic inch wall so thick and so high that for the next 40 years every pro stock car under their lights would be forced to live in the shadow of the mountain motors they murdered, because deep down every official knew the terrifying truth. The second they let one 850 cubic inch beast run at Pomona, the fans would never accept anything smaller ever again, and the factories would never write another sponsorship check. The 500 cubic inch limit wasn't a rule, it was a surrender dressed up as victory, and the classic era of drag racing would never be the same again. The Outlaws strike back. International Hot Rod Association keeps the flame alive. While NHRA slammed the 500 cubic inch gate shut and patted themselves on the back for saving pro stock, the International Hot Rod Association looked at the same rulebook, laughed until they cried, and said, "Boys, we just got handed the keys to the entire kingdom." Every independent racer with a welder, a dream, and a death wish loaded up their trailers and crossed the line like it was the Berlin Wall falling in reverse. Because under International Hot Rod Association banners there was no ceiling, no mercy, no factory overlords telling you how many cubic inches your heart could hold. Sonny Leonard, John Caz, Billy Ivy, Ricky Smith, and a dozen other mountain madmen went absolutely feral, boring cylinders until the water jackets were paper thin, stroking cranks until the throws almost touched, hanging titanium connecting rods so long they needed custom oil pans just to clear, welding symmetrical port cylinder heads that flowed like Niagara Falls, bolting on sheet metal, intake manifolds taller than church steeples, and crowning the whole unholy creation with Holley 4-barrel Dominator carburetors the size of trashcan lids. The results were apocalyptic: 6.20, 6.10, even high 5-second quarter miles at 230 plus miles per hour on nothing but naturally aspirated pump gasoline, 60-foot times that made funny cars blush, torque so violent the rear tires turned to smoke before the car moved an inch, and every single pass sounded like God and the devil having an argument through open headers. The grandstands at Bristol, Rockingham, and Darlington were no longer filled with spectators, they were filled with pilgrims who drove all night just to stand in the presence of 850 cubic inch salvation, women clutching their husbands' arms, grown men openly weeping when the burnout smoke cleared and revealed a hood scoop the size of a mailbox disappearing into a white cloud of tire carnage. NHRA officials would sneak across the fence in plain clothes, hiding their badges. watching in silent horror as International Hot Rod Association Pro Stock became the greatest show on earth while their own 500 cubic inch factory cars limped down the track half a second slower, looking like embarrassed little brothers. The television ratings told the story nobody wanted to say out loud. International Hot Rod Association events were selling out months in advance while NHRA struggled to fill half the seats. And every weekend another factory-backed driver would quietly load his trailer and defect to the unlimited side because deep down every real racer knows the truth. Cubic inches are king, torque is God, and nothing on this earth feels as right as 850 cubic inches of naturally aspirated American fury clearing its throat at 9,000 revolutions per minute. The International Hot Rod Association didn't just keep the mountain motor alive, they turned it into a religion. And for one glorious, untamed decade the Outlaws ruled the quarter mile while NHRA watched from the sidelines clutching their 500 cubic inch rulebook like a sinking man clutching a brick. The day the mountain motors almost came home, the failed NHRA reunion. By the late 1980s the secret could no longer be kept in a box. Every single weekend the International Hot Rod Association was selling out football-sized grandstands while NHRA sat half-empty watching their factory 500 cubic inch small block cars get laughed off the track by grainy VHS tapes of 850 cubic inch monsters running 6.10s at 230 miles per hour, and the factory executives who once demanded the 500 cubic inch limit were now the ones sweating because their multi-million-dollar sponsorship contracts were bleeding money faster than a stuck pig. The telephone lines from Detroit to Glendora burned red hot. Do something or we walk. And NHRA finally realized they had built a prison for themselves with their own rulebook, so in one of the most humiliating closed-door meetings in drag racing history they swallowed every ounce of pride, picked up the phone to Sonny Leonard, John Caz, and the Mountain Mafia, and basically begged on their knees for the mountain motors to come home, just for a few special exhibition races, just to fill the seats, just to shut the fans up, and the Outlaws, being the gracious Southern gentlemen they were, said yes. The deal was struck, 4 special Mountain Motor Pro Stock exhibitions a year under NHRA lights, 815 cubic inch limit, 2,400 pound minimum weight, naturally aspirated only, and the entire drag racing world held its breath because for the first time since 1982 the beasts were coming back to Pomona, Indianapolis, Gainesville, and Atlanta. The first exhibition hit like an atomic bomb. The grandstands sold out in hours. The burnout smoke was so thick you couldn't see the shutdown area, the 60-foot clocks flashed 1.22, the quarter-mile boards lit up with 6.18 at 229 miles per hour. The crowd didn't just cheer, they screamed until their throats bled, television ratings spiked higher than Top Fuel, and every factory 500 cubic inch car in the pits looked like it wanted to crawl under a rock and die. NHRA officials stood in the tower with fake smiles plastered on their faces while inside they were dying because the fans weren't just loving the mountain motors, they were demanding them full-time, chanting, "We want big cubes," loud enough to rattle the windows. And the factory sponsors who had forced the 500 limit in the first place were now the ones turning purple because their carefully groomed corporate image was getting curb-stomped by independent hillbillies with welding torches and open headers. The exhibitions were supposed to be a controlled taste, a little nostalgia to quiet the peasants, but instead they became a full-blown revolution, proof that the fans had never stopped wanting raw naturally aspirated torque, proof that NHRA had murdered the wrong golden goose, and after exactly 4 events the plug was pulled harder than a funny car parachute. The official excuse was safety concerns. The unofficial truth was panic in Detroit and panic in Glendora because the mountain motors weren't just faster, they were the future NHRA had spent a decade trying to kill, and the second the fans tasted real pro stock again they spit out the watered-down 500 cubic inch version like cheap wine. The reunion lasted 4 races, 4 perfect, glorious, heartbreaking races, and then the door slammed shut forever, leaving the Outlaws on one side, the factories on the other, and a generation of fans who would never forgive NHRA for showing them paradise and then ripping it away. When NHRA killed mountain motors, the Outlaws didn't quit. They went full outlaw. From backroad tracks in Georgia to no-time shoots in Florida, Sonny Leonard, John Caz, Ricky Smith and the Mountain Mafia kept building 820 to 930 cubic inch naturally aspirated monsters with symmetrical port heads, giant Holley 4-barrel Dominator carburetors and torque that turned tires to smoke before the car moved. Every weekend the word spread by payphone, "Big cubes tonight." Thousands showed up, standing on car hoods, screaming as the clocks hit 6.0s and 240+ mph on outlaw tracks with no timing towers. No factory paint, no 500 cubic inch handcuffs, just pure American fury. The underground became a church, the burnout box the altar, and the mountain motor the holy grail any buried but could never kill. As long as there were open headers and crazy men in the hills, the flame never died. It just burned hotter outside the rules. The day and finally ate crow. After 40 years of empty seats and 6.50 snooze fests, NHRA finally caved. They called the mountain outlaws they had banned and begged for a few exhibition races. 843 cubic inch limit, naturally aspirated, 2,450 pounds. When Jason Scruggs, Kerry Goforth, and John Montecalvo fired their Sonny Leonard/John Cos-built monsters, the sound alone cracked the sky, burnout swallowed the track, 60-foot times hit 1.18, and the clock stopped at 6.23 at 231 miles per hour. The crowd lost their minds, grown men cried, the grandstands shook with full season chants, and the factory 500 cubic inch cars looked like toys. NHRA smiled for the cameras while dying inside, because in 8 seconds flat the mountain motor proved it never died, it was just locked away, and the second they let it breathe again the fans made it crystal clear. They never wanted small cubes, they wanted raw, naturally aspirated violence, and the king was finally home. Why they'll never let them run full-time. Here's the cold truth nobody at NHRA will say out loud. Mountain motors will never run a full season because the factories, Chevrolet, Ford, Dodge, still pay the bills, and no corporate suit in Detroit wants their shiny new 500 cubic inch crate engine looking like a joke next to an independent 850 cubic inch outlaw monster built in a dirt floor shop for twice the money and 10 times the soul. The second a full mountain motor class exists, every factory sponsorship dollar walks out the door, television contracts get renegotiated downward, and the carefully crafted, factory hot rod image dies overnight. They tried exhibitions and the fans screamed for more, so NHRA did what they always do. Gave us just enough to shut us up, then slammed the gate again. It's not about safety, it's about control. 850 cubic inches naturally aspirated is the purest, loudest, most beloved form of pro stock that ever existed, and that's exactly why they'll keep it on a leash forever. Who really won the war? The factories won the war on paper. 500 cubic inches still rules NHRA, grandstands half empty, television board. But the mountain motor won where it matters. In every outlaw track, every backroad burnout, every heart that still pounds when 850 cubic inches clears its throat. NHRA killed the class to save the sponsors, but the outlaws kept the soul alive. Real pro stock never died. It just moved to the mountains and never looked back. The king is dead under NHRA lights. Long live the king everywhere else. So here's the bottom line. Brothers, NHRA can keep their quiet 500 cubic inch factory toys. The real pro stock, the one with fire, thunder, and 850 cubic inches of pure American soul, never died. It just went home to the mountains where nobody can chain it. If that makes your blood boil, smash that like button, drop, bring back big cubes, in the comments, subscribe to Regal Rides, and turn on the bell, because next time we're exposing the driver NHRA paid to disappear forever. This one's for Sonny, Cos, and every outlaw who kept the flame alive. Regal Rides. Keep it classic, keep it loud.